opposition.
Speaking first is Samuel, he, him, Dickinson.
Speaking second is Adi, he, they's fine. Consent to recording.
All right, CG.
I'll be speaking second. I'm author. I consent to recording. I'm not sure. Let me just check my partners here.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, I'm Karen
okay.
speaking first, she, her. I would prefer not to be recorded.
Hi, am I both audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Okay. I'll take POIs through chat and I'll try to take one from closing around like 4 or 5 minutes. Okay. 3, 2, 1. As a student myself, I can tell you this clearly. Just telling students and not giving them information on issues like sex and violence doesn't stop them from committing those acts. It doesn't stop them from having sex or being less violent, but it just makes them really less receptive to learning, and it makes them do it in significantly more dangerous and harmful ways. I'm going to have 2 pieces of the framing at the top of the speech. First, what is this motion likely to look like? I think you're likely to teach this in a way that is appropriate and is standardized in your country or in your local education system. What you teach to a 14 and 18-year-old is probably going to look very different in the way that you phrase it, and the videos that you show people, the brutality or the grotesqueness of the videos that you show, or the things that you talk about. Teachers in schools obviously don't want to face backlash. They're going to have standardized curriculums that are created by experts. So I think this is going to be done in a way that is quite effective and is age appropriate. Second piece of framing. Why school? I think one, just by the nature that you spend the most time there, you spend like 8 hours a day there for 5 to 6 days a week. You spend a lot of time there, you interact with a lot of people there. And the things that you learn at school often become the norms of what you think about and act in the future. It becomes really part of the way that you think. And that's why it's just really important to incorporate anything important into these curriculums at a young age. 2 arguments then from opening government. First, I'm going to talk about how this increases awareness of sexual assault and violence and very taboo topics that students need exposure to and need to learn about in an academic way. Second, I'll talk about how this increases education on historical injustices and other past wrongings that are otherwise unlikely to be revealed. Firstly, let's talk about increasing awareness. The premise of this argument is that children are often exposed to things like violence and sex anyways, through things like parties, alcohol is often there, violence, fights, drugs, sexual assault, sex happen all the time in high school, start off in middle school sometimes if you go to a less supervised or less regulated school or live in a less regulated area. This is often because of influences like media. You often see a lot of these things portrayed in the type of show that you watch. Like if you watch Euphoria or 13 Reasons Why, you would probably know what I'm talking about. Why is it then really good to include these types of things and educate students about these types of things within the curriculum? 3 structural reasons. 1, schools can standardize the type of education that you get about these topics. You are often going to be taught about these things by trained professionals like your teachers. They're able to package this information in a way that's easily digestible for you to understand, that facilitates healthy discourse and conversations on what you might not be able to talk about at home, what you feel uncomfortable about, the type of things that you feel during sex, what you feel after a school shooting, etc. Often just things that you are unable to have healthy discussions otherwise. This is often a very important countermeasure to the side-to-side daily conversations you have with your friends, because this is the only time in which you're going to have an academic way to talk about this with a teacher that is supervising you, that's going to lead to really healthy discussion. Second, this is probably the place in which you're going to get the most accurate information. This counters a lot of media influence that you watch. You're going to be looking at good resources, books, medias, analyzing it with a teacher, and noticing the type of biases that you have or what is truly happening within your body. Lastly, I think this is tied to a lot of good practical impacts. You start to think about issues through tests. You start to think about issues in an academic sense that isn't just the type of things you've seen on media. It's also really good because you're going to be engaging with works of art or works of literature that engage with these types of themes. You're going to start having ideologies ingrained into you. You're going to start having more empathy for people who have gone through different things that you're reading about in these books. Like if you read Know My Name, now you can if you've read Know My Name, which is a book about Chanel Miller who experienced sexual assault on the Stanford campus, you're able to see what things happened through her view. You're able to learn a lot about the legal education system around sexual assault. And these are all really important themes that children ought to have exposure to for the future. Why is this likely to be successful? 1, kids often feel that this is important because this is proximate education to things that are relevant to them in their real lives. They're likely to be receptive to so they're likely to be receptive and encouraged to learn about this. Second, even if schools don't actively teach it in a way that's good, we think the fact that you're learning about it at the school is a tipping point for you as a child to get more interested in it and research it in the future, or at least have a somewhat more amount of information that you would otherwise. There's probably a good impact overall. Why is the comparative really bad of minimized role in education? Because the information that you get from anywhere that isn't education, if you just think about a high schooler's life, is probably going to be your friends who also get their information from places like media, who get their information about sex from places like porn, which tell you it's okay to rape young girls, which sexualize young girls in school uniform, and make it really blurry what the line between consent and rape is. You're going to be learning about these types of things like violence and sex from your parents, who can often be very conservative or religious, who might also have received education from these medias and porns or whatever, that is still going to really that is still really harmful for the way that they view individuals and the way that they view society. So your view is likely to become really warped, especially if you're like in a more conservative area or in a conservative household, and you're just never going to have access to good information. So you will have exposure, but you will have exposure to things like sex. You will have exposure to things like violence, but you just won't really know how to deal with those issues. So you're going to probably make worse decisions overall as a child because you don't really know what to do. You don't have a lot of mentors. You don't have someone you can feel comfortably talk to. And that's just really bad for you. What is the impact of this? One, I just think on an individual and emotional level, these works often help you describe and analyze and verbalize the way you feel after things, how you feel after getting sexually assaulted, how you feel after a school shooting, how you feel after your first time having sex. When you're in these vulnerable states and you don't know how you feel and you're scared and you feel alone, but you don't want to talk to it to other people because it's still a taboo subject, often these books and arts that you read and analyze at school become a safe space for you to understand your feelings and deal with that like in an emotional capacity. But secondly, schools just become a far safer environment for these students, which is obviously very important because students just spend a lot of time in these places. You learn about the things like the importance of consent. You resolve the bias of like Black students you may have at your school and conceiving them as violent because you realize the type of structural reasons as to why you might be thinking that way, because you read about the type of violence that they've experienced in the past. And I'll explain that more in our second argument. This is really important because these future children are our future voters. They become more receptive to the important conversations in the future, and they become more open-minded when you try to talk about these things when they become more important as well. Secondly, why does this increase historical education of injustice? What's censored in status quo is often things like historical arts regarding US colonization, violent social movements, the impact of sexual assault, explicit mentions of harms, things like comfort women in Korea. Those are often things that are heavily censored around the world because they're seen as too taboo. Why is showing these types of works really important? One, I think this is a prerequisite to state reforms because people are now more aware of these issues. Second, you're able to counter certain narratives or bias better because you're less ignorant. You can see that because now even if you see media saying like, oh, Black people are so violent, that's why there's police brutality, you now have more awareness and understanding of the real reasons as to why Black on Black crime happens because you learn more about it at school and you learn more about the real reasons behind these violence instead of just being convinced by like false media covers. But also this is just a prerequisite to making people apologetic and knowing what they've done in the past and knowing why that was bad. It makes people more aware of various issues that have happened around the world. I think the prerequisite to learning and not repeating the same mistakes of our history is knowing about those mistakes that have happened in the past and being apologetic for them. And this is really important for victims and future progression. For all those reasons, vote OG.
All right, thank you, PM Elo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. POIs in the chat, please. I'll try to take one round. 5 minutes or so. Yeah. All right. We're gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The very first thing I want to do is just clarify what this motion actually looks like. It looks like things like art of naked people or depictions of sex in literature. It does not look like literal sex education classes. So those are actual classes that schools already have, but this debate is constrained specifically to art and literature classes. That is where the first mistake that OG makes. They make these very overextending claims that this is going to largely affect the way people view things like sex and all this other types of education. But they recognize these are not the places to discuss this, because at the end of the day, these classes are still trying to teach you things about literature, they're still trying to teach you things about art, and these teachers are specifically trained in those subjects, not in the subject that they are trying to advocate to teach these people. This is particularly bad then because they are just not not the places in which they would do this, but also note that the counterfactual is just we already have things like health classes that these people are already required to be taking, that we already have things like sex education classes that they're already going into, and they are also, it's just also the case that schools are trying to expand access to things like counselors as there is more awareness growing about things like mental health, etc. So these are already resources that people have access to. Did occur to me why they need this in their art and literature classes. I think then I want to do a little bit of rebuttal before I get to an extension about why this is extremely triggering for these individuals and why this is probably going to lead to backlash, harming education overall. On the large material, the rest of the material they give you is they're going to be able to see this stuff, they process, they turned it into like education about like violence and all these other types of things. Few reasons why this isn't the case. The first thing is all of the history. These people are already required to take history classes. These are the ones that have been doing things like teaching about racism, etc. So talking about violence is not a unique mechanism to show that Black people suffered. That is what your history class is for. Secondly, it should be going to be why teaching about violence necessarily means you're going to be teaching about racism in good ways. Like just because they show violence does not give them fiat power to mean that you're going to be showing racism and then showing that racism in good lights. In fact, I think you can turn this. Like there are many places like rural Alabama, for example, which can show violence and use this as a way to criminalize Black people and say, hey, they're thugs and bad people. People incredibly then why just the presence of violence necessarily means you're talking about structural themes like racism. They give you no warrant for that. They then say that you're going to have more empathy for these people. One, I think it's probably the case that you're already consuming other types of this media anyway, so people can be why these classes are specifically the places that are going to be fostering this types of empathy. Secondly, though, I just people can be whether you don't already have empathy for these people. If you just recognize they are experiencing a harm, then it's unclear why a literature class or an art class is uniquely going to teach you to feel empathy for someone who is sexually assaulted. You probably already feel empathy for them right now. The final thing they tell you is that the alternative is bad because you prefer other media. This is still symmetric though, because if they're getting it from like social media or stuff, these people are getting those, still looking at social media on their side of the house. They're probably then going to prefer that media over school. A few reasons why. One, they're probably going to hate school because they see it as an institution that gives them like grades and stuff like that. It's extremely stressful, so they have a hard time actually accessing it. Secondly, teachers are really rude to them. They do things like give them bad grades, and if they mess up, then they feel a lot of pressure from those teachers, so they're not really going to trust them. So people can be why they would ever buy the school what the school tells them over what the media tells them. I think this is incredibly unlikely then. But even if we give them their best case, I think that this is still a bad and worse way to process these types of messages. Why? I think that school is just not the place to learn these types of things because it's too intellectual. Recognize that teachers do not have an actual incentive to learn about these things because one, teacher is incredibly overworked. Just recognize they have to do tons of like quizzes they have to grade, they make all these types of projects, etc. So they have so many responsibilities on top of the fact that they have to do things like take care of their families. Secondly, I think that schools are just incredibly poor. Recognize that they get their money from things like property taxes, but if they're not their homes around their compact have a lot of money, which means they can't do things like pay for training, which means teachers are not going to be very good at teaching these things. Secondly, I think they're going to have non-mature peers. Like if your peers are all like 14, 15, 16-year-olds, not incredibly mature, not able to discuss these themes in good ways. Thirdly, I think you're just too young to fully experience or rationalize these themes without proper guidance, insofar as your teachers are not proper guides, or not able to properly use these. Finally, though, because this academic space is extremely intellectual, you're not able to feel the emotions of this. That is, you're being told to do things like break it down into themes and stuff like that. Like look at the like words that they're using and things like that, because that's what literature and art classes do, but not actually look at the experience itself, which means all the impacts that they say are so good are things you're not able to access in their set house. That's an immediate turn on their case. Great. On why this is triggering and backlash then. We first think this is incredibly triggering for people who are sexual assault victims or people who grew up in violent neighborhoods. Just recognize for many people, school is an escape mechanism from horrors at home, because recognize if their parents are incredibly abusive, they can go to things like school and just feel safe there. But if you introduce these types of themes largely into the curriculum that they're experiencing, and they can't escape it, maybe it was constrained to history class and arts in the house, but now they see it in their literature classes, in their art classes, and maybe math and science is the only ones where they don't see this becomes it makes them feel far less safe, which means largely they just feel less safe in school, and they also and this also just things like increases the risk of personal harm because you're re-traumatizing them by showing them all these other things. I think additionally though, it's incredibly hard for them to opt out. They're just really young to do this, and so they don't know that one, opting out is a solution. Two, they're just incredibly timid because they haven't grown into their full selves, and three, they don't want to reveal the fact that they have trauma. And even if they do try to opt out, it's very hard to separate this type of work, so teachers are going to have a difficult time helping them opt out. This largely means they cannot opt out of this. This secondly means that there's going to be large amounts of backlash. A few reasons why. One, there are incredibly religious parents who view these as bad things to look at. Secondly, there are parents who generally who find general safety concerns, especially with the trigger material I gave you above. And finally, there are people who generally just hate change. They don't like seeing these education systems change in ways that they cannot predict because they've been used to a specific system. They grew up with a specific system that taught them that way, and so they expect their kids to learn those exact same things. This makes backlash likely because they see their kids as their future, so they're extremely protective of them. They want to protect them. Before I go on, CG.
If backlash exists, it'll probably exist towards other things like sex education, all of that, if parents are religious. Why is this the tipping point?
Okay, I think there are a few things. One, things like sex education, etc., are not permeated throughout the entire curriculum, so it's harder for them to get rid of this or to feel backlash against it. Secondly, it's something that's become a norm over time, but the point at which you are doing this immediately, then people see this, it goes into the news as it becomes something that people obviously care a lot more about. This leads into the impact. I think that this is more likely to take away things like sex education, because recognize if religious parents see that this happens, the first thing they're just going to say is, well, we don't need things like sex education anymore. But insofar as those classes are better, that's worse for these students. So you're much more likely to remove those classes because you are seen as introducing these themes, and so much of the backlash is you have to remove those types of programs, which is worse for them, which actually flips to the POI that we just got. Secondly, I think this just generally decreases funding for these types for those general types of programs. But insofar as they're the ones that have trained professionals, insofar as they're the ones that are not incredibly academic circles, but rather ones that are emotional and that allows people to actually vent their trauma, talk about their problems, then there are far better and productive spaces, and so we should far more prioritize those types of spaces than the types of spaces that OG wants to foster, since they give no mechanism for why they're going to foster actually good discussions about the themes they discuss. For all these reasons, very, very much opposed.
All right, thank you, hello, DPM.
Hi. I'll take my POI in the chat, probably at the 5th minute by the closing opposition team for engagement purposes. Jesus. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 4 things in the speech. First, framing relative to the material in OO. Second, additional responses to the opposition case line. Third, explanations for why school is the best actor to teach this. And finally, why we are debate winning. So first, framing relative to the material in OO. What we suggest is that works of art are likely going to be pushed in schools, are going to be works of art that are academic material that is reviewed by a board of education, which contains materials that is beneficial to developing children, and their ability to think and learn like every other subject that is incorporated into the education system and syllabus, which means that when there are graphic portrayals in the literature or works of art that is studied, it is likely going to be academic material that looks towards the material reasons for why harmful and graphic outcomes happen on the planet. Which means A, if it includes works that depict violence, you need to look at the comparative of a world where these things are censored in the status quo, because that is the material that we would allow under our side of the house. This looks like the harms of historical injustices that teach people the structural ways in which their state and its history had already harmed minority groups or their citizens, historical coverage on genocides with graphic depictions of the extent of evil that had existed in the violence that happened, or even day-to-day violence that happens in their state, whether that violence be poverty, where people are harmed every single day from things like malnutrition, or things like police brutality or immigration violence that happens. Generally things that are educational towards these kids in understanding the society they live in. But B is if it includes sexual themes, it likely includes sexual education, which teaches students about safety measures, on avoiding STDs or having safe sex, which leads to the primary impact of having safer sex leading to less accidental pregnancies, ruining less lives, or spreading diseases. Additionally, that the material is likely to cover further information on things like consent, which teaches children that there are varying degrees of consent that ought to be followed, the same way that schools teach the subjects they do in ways that incorporate ethics as well. There are 2 reasons for why this happens. There is an effective separation of powers from the state and its education sector in the provision of this education. The first is that the debate has to be about states that have some level of separation of powers. Because if this debate is about states that want to mind control their population, then opposition has no comparative for two sub-reasons. The first is that the parents in a society that is prone to revisionist histories or a state that is authoritarian are likely to encompass the values of their state due to the stateside propaganda from schools prior, as well as their exposure to the media and stateside news. But two is that the media that surrounds this type of authoritarian society is heavily censored anyway, right? Meaning that there isn't a counter narrative that is likely to be introduced under their side regardless, which would mitigate the vast majority of harms that they could potentially talk about, which means that the bad places where this policy will happen badly will be bad regardless. Op has to prove to you that this is different. But B is, if society is as fragile as they say, then the parents will be angry. Then this normalization becomes even more important because it's important for kids to learn about problems in the world they will have to face when they are grown-ups. The process of normalization for these issues allows you to talk about these issues more and have more discourse about it, in comparison to their side, where people are uncomfortable talking about issues that do harm people from day-to-day in their day-to-day lives. What we suggest is that we provide a platform for people to discuss these things, therefore promote solutions towards these problems as well. Second, additional responses to OO. The first thing they say is that they will show naked bodies because sex education exists everywhere already. My question is, where, right? Like, where does sex education in Malaysia exist if you're a 14-year-old student, or in India or Pakistan? Just because they exist where the debater lives doesn't mean it isn't absent in the majority of the planet. But two, is that they say they have no money to train teachers, so this will be bad. Okay, if this is true, then their teachers suck at teaching everything else. Additionally, this means that the works that are educative under their side are badly developed, meaning that outsourcing works that are produced by a body that is not the poorly funded school that they rely on for their response, with horrible ability to teach, will be accessible to these kids, and at least these kids will learn something. Third is, if parents find safety concerns, then you have to note that this material is going to be material that challenges the opinion of the children, that is separate from the interpretations of what these children ought to know based on the parents and based on the state that they live in. Why we debate winning? What we prove is that school is the best institution and actor to disseminate this information for three structural reasons. The first is that the school is able to standardize these teachings. There are trained professionals that are taught to package things to be delivered to children in ways that do not directly traumatize or harm them, as well as makes it engaging to them. But secondly, that the school has resources to be able to buy books and disseminate books and works of art that are expensive, that would, in the comparative, be too expensive for these individuals to buy if they come from poor places. The school also has access to databases to purchase these books from stores in large scales, meaning at worst, we get an additional provision of books and art that teens can now critique. And the parents would also be forced to teach these children why the teachings are bad if they want to undo these teachings. Third, it forces them to think critically about the situation through things like grading and testing, because they have to learn this material to be able to score well in their curriculars. Before I go into the impacts of this, I'll take a POI from Sia. Oh.
Yeah, you've never explained why this being in literature classes means you're going to be talking about these in ways like sex education. You're just going to be talking about the literature itself, so you don't talk about the themes that you say are so good.
So I already explained that it is within the incentive of schools to be able to teach you things that benefit you in terms of your education. This is why you don't see random works from people that you don't know when you are reading your school textbook, because they cite academic sources, because newsflash, I guess school is part of academia. Okay, going into impacts. I think that this increases awareness on things like sexual assault and violence, which they're likely to be exposed to due to analysis that Yeonwoo gave you. Things like parties, bullying happening, or doing drugs or alcohol means that these individuals, these kids, need an outlet to deal with these violence and issues and find out the best course of action to take within these circumstances. But two, the students are more likely to engage in the curricula because they feel as if these problems that are taught in schools are proximate and relevant to their circumstances and experience, versus under their side of the house, where they have no mechanism to ensure that these kids are going to delve into these types of things. The third is that the teachers teach kids to find patterns. So even if you believe that this is horrible material about horrible situations, which is stateside biased depictions of it, this is still good because these structures of oppression are complex. To propagandize realize they need to teach these systems happening, and being able to identify these patterns changes how receptive they are to the nature of these things when they grow up, because a school is a place for them to be able to learn, and they're receptive to learning, which is important because these people eventually become voters and decide on the policy of your state. For these reasons, we win this debate.
All right, thank you, DPM, DLO.
Let's do POIs both in the chat, and if you can like visibly wave on screen, I'll be looking to take one on the diagonal around 2-3 minutes. There is a structural problem with the opening government's case. Very simply, they take a series of impacts in a motion that is limited to literature and art classes, and then they try to find impacts within the context of literally every other subject. This is not sufficient within the context of the debate to prove that their case stands. Why? Because there are different countries and different places and different municipalities, and they have different norms and different ideals, and they have a different degree of flexibility with what they are willing to teach their children. In certain countries, certain places, certain municipalities, they are willing to engage in discussions about structural violence and racism and sex and the risks associated with sex with their children. The problem is, in those places, there already exists extant social and political will to have those classes be taught in far more relevant settings. Very simple argument that Sam made. It is better that a relatively qualified sex education teacher teaches you sex ed than an English teacher whose qualifications include deciphering Macbeth. Now, it is obviously the case that there are some places where the social norms have not moved to the point where they would be willing to have discussions of sexual violence in a sex ed class, or discussions of structural violence in a history class. But it is just worth like observationally noting that those places will not magically get very productive curricula that slip their way into the literature or arts classes and shoehorn these very progressive ideologies into the minds of kids via this like mechanistic backdoor. No, in places where it is taboo to discuss these topics, even if you are willing to kind of bring these works of art and literature into the curriculum, you will be analyzing them purely from an academic space. You will not get any of the social or cultural impacts that the opening government seeks to claim, because the curricula is designed by those self-same people who would refuse the admittance of those topics into any classroom. The opening government case falls. CG, if you want to engage, I'll take your extension before I get into my constructive material. OG, I'll give you a chance.
So aren't there economic pressures to states to make sure that the material they're teaching their kids is going to be something that's beneficial for their development?
I just think like when you look at the empirical reality surrounding the politics of schools, socio-cultural norms are a far more controlling factor than the kind of net aggregate GDP boost you might get from an educated electorate. The real reality is the impacts of that economic boost are so distant and so disparate, they're so hard to link directly back into individual policy change, whereas the social and cultural backlash you experience from exposing kids to things that their parents don't want them to see are so proximate to the bureaucracy and the political apparatus of the school that it's the social cultural norms that really govern our school curriculums. And I think that coheres with like our understanding of the way this works, right? Technocrats just, maybe they run the math and science curriculums. They certainly do not run the culturally sensitive curriculums at schools. So, right, so at the point at which the opening government failed to link their case into art and literature specifically, they really have no place in the round. But they do make one point that I think could form the basis of an extension, which is, you know, kids these days are going to get exposed to violent and sexual media kind of irregardless. Isn't it good that school serves as a proving ground to prepare them for the real world? The answer we're going to make, we're going to say really simply is no, because there's a problem-solution mismatch. The problem is a humanistic one.
You need a humanistic understanding of structural violence. You need a humanistic understanding of sexual interaction in order to be able to succeed as a well-informed citizen, good person, good partner in the world. School is going to provide you an academic understanding. And if you don't believe these are the same thing, I'll just give you an argument by intuition that is ridiculously compelling. Do you think you can learn how to have sex from a book? If you do, then, Jesus, I'm wrong. But I really don't think you can. And at the point that's the case, if school is only giving you an academic understanding, that does not suffice to serve as a solution to the problem of a lacking humanistic understanding for these 14-year-old children. Why is school going to provide you an academic understanding? Well, a few reasons, right? There's a curriculum standardization. And at the point that's the case, the curriculum is not going to be able to account for a humanistic curriculum because it is fundamentally impossible to standardize humanistic teachings. They're necessarily one-on-one. They rely on a social dialogue that often relies on subtextual clues like body language, or the degree at which students are willing to engage, or the degree at which students are willing to internally discuss these ideas amongst peer groups, et cetera, et cetera. These are just not things you can get from a multiple choice test or an SAT. The second, obviously, is the academic or ivory tower bias. These teachers studied English and they studied art, and that's their comfort zone. Guys, it's going to be really awkward to try to explain the nuances of sexual assault to a bunch of 14-year-olds. You could not pay me to do it. Why are we assuming that teachers, who are some of the most structurally underpaid people on the planet, with degrees only in art and literature, are now a successful vector and mechanism to be able to have those conversations? I don't care how standardized the curriculum is. Those words would struggle to come out of my mouth. And I think that's probably true for everyone in this room. And I think everyone in this room knows it's probably true about them. But thirdly, I want to talk about the solution mechanisms, because there are solution mechanisms, right? People do emerge broadly aware and broadly cognizant of how to engage with concepts of structural violence and concepts of sex. And the way they do that is a far more experiential form of learning, right? You kind of just go out and learn, where you engage with people who have suffered harms as a cause of these things, or you engage with works of art within the context of a social friend group, where you can have a more experiential discussion about the nature of this art and how you engage with it. Look, I'm not going to say everyone does it. I think there are probably a lot of people who have never looked at lewd art in their life, and probably a lot of people who don't care for literature and don't read all that much. But that's fine, we think, at the point at which the trade-off costs are so high. You are literally condemning teachers into an unwinnable situation. You are condemning students into an inevitably triggering situation. And you are condemning these schools into a no-win political situation at the point at which you are taking what is an important, thorny, and difficult subject to teach, handing it to a group of individuals who are supremely unqualified to do it, and kind of just hoping and praying that it works. It won't. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, Diallo, for that speech. Member of Golf.
Sorry, my
point in which we have more artists creating more artwork that people care about, I think that's a good thing. That helps people resonate with. I think that's a good thing. 3, generally art is just very enjoyable, and we get more of that on our side of the house, and that's good. But lastly, I think it also I think for these reasons we're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Member of Golf, Member of Op.
It's important to talk about what purpose art and literature has in schools today. This is central for this team to win this debate. I think we're going to make this right. And I think most of the teams up until now have not done this enough, right? Let's talk about what OG has proposed, like what government has proposed in general. And like some general rebuttal in this regard, I think most school systems are already designed to support pupils in regards to violence and sex, right? We already have classes that teach sexual education, that raise sexual awareness, for example, for assaults or something. We have classes that teach safe sex, for example, by using contraception. And we also have classes that, like schools also are structured and designed to teach pupils to not engage in violence, right? We have history classes that talk about the world wars, for example, which are constructed to teach pupils to not engage in violence, that violence is something bad, that they should not condone in any way. Secondly, it is taught to pupils to not hurt other pupils. Thirdly, schools have the societal function to convey certain values to children. This is extremely important to schools. Teachers are supporters for pupils, are supposed to be like persons of authority to support children, which means if they notice a pupil to have problems with violence, for example, at home, they are instructed to seek help for this pupil, right? They are instructed to contact the police or contact the social services to if this person has trauma, they should contact a therapist or something. So we already have measures in place to make sure that violence and sex are properly addressed in schools. And even if we would not have those measures, this would be our counter proposal, right? We think that literature and art are not the right way to counteract this problem. I think all of those measures I have just explained to you would be far more effective in order to engage in this problem. So I think that the government bench in general has a central problem solution mismatch, which is extremely important. We are talking about art and literature. This means we're talking about 2 hours in a normal school week in which pupils are supposed to learn something about art and literature. Now I'm going to explain to you what the purpose of those limited 2 hours in the given school week are. First of all, students, the purpose of art and literature is that it seeks to support pupils to find some kind of identity in this very important phase of their life. They should find their own identity, and they should find values, right? They should think about something like, what is the meaning of life? How do people react to extreme events, like, for example, death or love, on an emotional level? So they should engage on an emotional level with some kind of character in a book and think about this and reflect on this. Thirdly, they should think about what priorities other people have in their life. For example, is work more important than love, or is money important? Something like this. So they should form some kind of identity, and art and literature class are supposed to make this happen. Secondly, art and literature seeks to give students an understanding for the culture of the specific country this is about, this school system is set in. For example, where does our culture come from historically? What actions are socially acceptable if I perform them or not in my culture, in my society? Those things are best taught via literature and art that explain how this culture in this country has developed over time, how those values that are dominant in this culture have started existing. And this teaches students to take some kind of place in society, how to interact in regards to other person in society. Also, it is an important, it teaches important basic values for pupils. It also gives them some kind of orientation in life, how to make basic decisions. Should I stay in school for a few more years? Should I go to university? What is important for me in my life? Thirdly, art and literature is important to support pupils to cope with very basic and intense emotions they have and they feel in this very important period of their life. They should cope with very stressful emotions. For example, am I good enough? Am I capable to achieve all of the things that society expects of me, that my parents expect of me, that I expect of me myself, right? And this is a very important skill which they should form in life, and art and literature in school is supposed to make this happen. And it also teaches empathy to students, right? They should have empathy with the character in a book in order to like convey some kind of basic information, right? So all of those skills should be developed, all of those impacts should be created by art and literature in school. It's not about sexual assault or violence at all, right? So it's also not capable to teach safe sex or to escape violence at home or to confront traumas of sexual outcomes, right? So this is not the purpose of art and literature. Now, when you set up this curriculum, we are saying that those purposes, those basic principles are our main selector criteria for those like art pieces, right? Because we do have only like probably 2 hours a week, so we have very limited time to make this happen, to create this impact. And we also have like limited resources for teachers because they do have to read the art or the books they are presenting, right? So we can only present a limited amount of art and literature to pupils in school. In our world, we are not prioritizing violence or sex in any way, right? This is not important to us because the like fundamental like purpose of our art and literature in school is our main criteria of selection, right? Government now is trying to primarily focus on violence and sex, and this has the negative consequence that if you have like a different option to choose from, and you have like options that have interesting characters are important for this specific phase of a pupil because very basic themes are discussed in this book, right? And you have a different book that has like violence and sex in it, like government would choose the second book because this is very important to them, although this is completely unfit for the purpose of art and literature, and you could implement much better and more effective measures. We are saying they are like they are choosing books that are not important, not helpful in order to implement the basic purpose of literature. Is not creating the impact we're seeking. So the actual impact that is important for those classes is decreasing in the end because they're choosing the wrong type of literature because of those reasons proposed.
All right, thank you, member of Government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
My internet's a bit shaky. Is it alright if I don't turn my camera on?
Yep, sure, no problem.
I prefer POIs in the chat. I'll also probably stop my speech at some point and ask for one. Okay, I'm starting. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. The first is go over our extension, why is the most important argument in the debate. Then I'm going to look at the back-half comparison and then the short diagonal. So firstly, on the extension, I think there's a few unique things that Karen tells you that CEO doesn't really engage with. The first is that our extension has the greatest marginal impact of any argument in the debate. So even before we get into it, I want to note that our frame of this debate was to look at it in a realistic manner, not try to overreach our impacts, but giving you impacts that was certain to occur, and that's like one form of weighing that we take over every other case. So if you broadly look at what you got from the opening half, OG's arguments are generic towards why talking about sex and violence in schools is good and not really exclusive to art and literature. And like there may be an argument as to why art is a good complementary tool to sex education, but the delta on that argument is far less when you compare it to what we tell you, which is like the purpose of art and literature education, that is to get people thinking critically about society and about art and why that in and of itself is a good thing. And all arguments on backlash and triggers and like how this is triggering is once again really non-comparative and doesn't have a lot of like marginal impact in this debate, because presumably those issues would arise with alternatives like sex education and or like whatever else they stand for. So what was our extension, and why is CEO's lack of direct response to that extension really important in this debate? So the first thing that we told you in Karen's speech is that good art, like what we usually consider good art, like Greek tragedies and Shakespearean dramas, often like have one of their central themes as being sexual or violent themes. And when you do not discuss like themes which are central to good art, then your understanding of that kind of art that sort of defies social norms and change culture, becomes a lot weaker, which means that you don't get to appreciate art, but you also don't get to appreciate the impact that had on people. And why, when you flip that, the benefits of understanding good art in and of itself are good enough to win us this debate. I want to remind you of what those benefits were and expand on a bit of them. So firstly, if you have children at a broad scale understanding what we consider to be good art, or like understanding why Shakespearean dramas were that changing of culture, or why Greek tragedies and why sex was really important to like the story there, then what you do is firstly, you defeat elitist trends in arts which exist today, when a good understanding of what people consider to be real art isn't limited to kids who got private school education, who just got like a private school education, or like privileged kids who could like afford to like do things like hire tutors to understand the meaning behind good art. But you get like people as a whole, and like middle class kids as well, means that the art that you have in the future is likely to be more representative of society. But also, and I think CEO talks about this, is why a good understanding of art is really important for processes like self-reflection and your ability to do things like engage with art and find your identity. I'll talk a little more about this when I get to the back half comparison in this debate. Is a lot better when you are like able to do things like critically understand why, like how violence may be used in like rap songs today, or like why sex is like a really important aspect of like the development of female characters in art today, means that the way in which you connect art to your personal identity right now is a lot more meaningful, and that is a much bigger marginal impact than anything else, like just being a good complement towards sex education or historical education or anything that OO talks about. Let's do a little more like direct comparisons on the back half. So what is CEO's extension in this debate? I think they talk to you about like, they give you some good framing as to like what the importance of art and literature education is, but I think the crucial issue is they don't do any of the work to tell you either why these principles of art and literature education, like, and like why violence and sex doesn't fit into these principles, or they don't tell you like why it crowds it out. They just give you like another alternative or like another viewpoint of what art and literature is, without necessarily telling you like what the issue is of including sex and violent education. But if we had to take CEO's own frame, that it's like do things like find your own identity, then I've already spoken to you about why like including violence or sexual themes is really important for that, because particularly when you have like kids at the age of 14-15 who are gradually becoming more sexually active, or like are for the first time becoming conducive to what violence looks like in the real world, the only way that you can make art meaningful to them, or a meaningful part of their identity, given the fact like they're gonna have all these other like sexual experiences, or like they're going to do things like open TV and like look at like the violent crimes being committed, is if you discuss these really important parts of everyday life within like education in school, so that they can form a better viewpoint of like themselves and fulfill the purpose of artistic education, as CEO talks about in relation to society. Before I move on to the short diagonal, I'll take a POI from OO.
Yeah, kids like things like music, superheroes, games, all these other things. People can me why sex is the only way to get them to engage in art and literature.
I mean, even if kids like have like a superficial understanding of art and music, like today, our entire point is that we should like work to change that, and that's like why that case is. But I didn't really understand that view, if I'm being honest. So looking at the short diagonal, I think if you look at OO's case and the rest of CEO's case, which I think was largely derivative, is that they give you a lot of reasons as to a lot of reasons as to like why like teaching of like art and violence will be imperfect or will not be great, but don't really give you like they don't really give you like anything mutually exclusive as to why you should necessarily not include this at all. Because even if it is imperfect, even if like the funding isn't great and there is some degree of social backlash, that just proves that we need to maybe change the way in which we teach this. I think the only negative outcomes they're able to prove are limited towards two things. The first is backlash. Within backlash, I'm not sure why this is a net negative. The first thing is I think it's contestable whether this backlash exists at all. Because if you have like a society which is really, really religious, or like really, really conservative, then presumably you don't have good sex education anyways, and neither side can like debate those kind of outcomes. The societies where you're likely to have backlash is if you have like religious groups in an otherwise conservative society not liking these kind of like art cultures, like these kind of art and literature classes. But if that's the case, then I asked him in a PUI, like, why is this the tipping point? Like, if they live within a progressive society, and like this school like teaches sex education, and like they're doing things like seeing the way popular media like discusses sex and things like that, and they're still sending their kids to school to interact with like multi-ethnic people, then there probably is a good reason for that. And they haven't given us any work as to why this is like the tipping point towards this. But even if it is the tipping point, if the backlash is limited towards a few religious groups in an otherwise progressive society, then that probably means these classes won't get taken down. And like, I'm not sure what the net impact is. Again, like, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the idea of like why this stuff can be potentially triggering, because that's just like an issue about like talking about like controversial issues in school in general. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them. It just probably means we should moderate the way we do so. We beg you to propose.
All right, thank you, Kofweb Opweb.
I know it sounds sad, but life is not like in 80% of the cases not about sex. Let's be real. There's so many other things that are important in school that need to be taught to children in art and literature class. This all the reasons that has Felix given you. And I do believe that in the end, we are giving you the best case what children should be learning, what school is for, and why we should not prioritize showing sex and violence in like art and literature in school. A few responses to CG. They are saying that like you get basically a better access to literature to students if you're talking about these things, like you give them like, because it's pretty important in their life, in their students' lives, and they are probably then learn better about literature and why art is so great and far more enjoyable when they are learning about that. We think that it's probably also they probably also be consuming actually media outside the classes, and they probably also like literature class is not about just having fun. It's about certain discussions. It's about certain historical discussions about some if they need to like historical reasons. It's about the way society is created through art, how it is viewed, how other worlds are viewed. And we think in the end, it is probably better if we learn all that instead of actively focusing on the sex part and the violence part, because that is not only what we are like learning is about. And also we're saying that these principles, like even sex and violence, we are not actually reducing them. We are just minimalizing them. We're not focusing on them. When they come up and they are important, we say, okay, then they might be pretty important, then it's something we can talk about, but we are not actively focusing on talking about these things. And Felix has given you many like reasons why we should also focus on the other stuff. So like school and even like the school plan or even the government or whatever have a certain interest in mind in creating these types of plans. They want a good citizen. They want to give like societal value. They want to make sure that, for example, students are I don't know, what the truth is, what the meaning of life is, what a happy life looks like. And this is all the stuff we are already taught, or we need to talk about more, because especially in this time frame from 14 to 18, yes, they might be horny, let's be real, and they might learn something, but they probably learn it either way. But they need to find themselves in society. They need to learn about the historical changes. They need to find they need to learn about their state. They need to find their values in life. And we also think that is that they can do through literature. They need to learn how to feel about other people. They need to make sure that they are in top with their feelings. And this is all the stuff that is Felix is giving you uniquely, and that literature is so much more than just like focusing on learning how to be like a sexual and what is wrong and what is right. Also, we think that then the parents will probably like appreciate it if their pupil, if their child learns about all the societal norms. So let's focus now on what the other. That in comparison to CG, we are actually winning because we are giving you far more values that need to be thought and are making like a good like literature lesson quite well. They are only focusing why these sex and violence are making better literature. We don't believe so. If you look at Hamlet, and if you are focusing there with where he probably is in love of have sex with Ophelia and not all the other values, I think that's a pretty minor part. So we are giving you far more principles that are far more important to get to a better pupil. So I think OG was also talked about a lot in this debate. I think in the end, they are missing the point that it will not that it decreases sexual assault, because already pointed out by already pointed out by Felix, that it is probably the case that there are other resources in school, and even if then we are not sure that we can we have some missing mechanisms there, because just because it is talked about in class, it does not mean that sexual assault will happen, and it is also not the case that historical injustice will suddenly be far more discussed for all the reasons that also OO gave. Like teachers still have some freedom, teachers still are overworked and underpaid, and probably can do what they want to do, and in the probably in most cases they probably be just, oh yeah, that here you have the sexual scene, we discuss it in the most shallow way, and probably they do also have not in most cases the resources for good books, even if it's in an academic discourse. If you don't have any money, you will also not buy any good books. Let's be real. So why are we winning now over OO? OO is giving us two main points here. So they are saying, oh, it's incredibly triggering. We say that is kind of, yeah, okay, but like, to be honest, even sexual education for these people who experienced like sex and violence, or even like some sort of, will also be triggering. So what we are giving you is actual societal changes that people can be discussed. And the second thing they are doing is that yeah, the education thing is harming overall, and we probably have no good. I think we are looking actually at the children, which are pretty important here. We are saying that these children are the main focus, and that's why we are pro to oppose.